during these last few weeks. I know it's home stretch in the semester. Today, I'm going to talk to you guys about examining how presidents use the power of speech to lead a country. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about President Reagan and his 2 terms and how he accomplished nuclear disarmament during the Cold War. So to begin, presidents use speech to decide how they're going to lead a nation and how they're going to be laying out the guidelines for what their administration is going to accomplish. We'll see in our first speech that John F. Kennedy used his words to engage the people into civic engagement.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
And then more recently, we have President Obama, who, in a time during when the country was going through recession, encouraged the people that change and hope was coming to America.
But tonight, because of what we did on this day, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
And so, my fellow Americans.
To get on topic, we're going to go and take a look into the Cold War. Now, I know when you're going through your lectures, Cold War is kind of a hard concept to understand. I'm going to try and break it down for you. So Cold War was really a conflict of ideas. On one side, you had the Soviet Union, which was expanding into communism into the globe. And then on the other side, you had the United States that was championing democracy. Now, battles did exist across the country during the Cold War, but it never existed on the actual soil between the United States and the Soviet Union. For example, we had the Vietnam War is a great example. But specifically, the reason why both countries were at angst with each other was that both of them had access to nuclear weapons, and they were both fearful of each other and cautious because they didn't want to launch and escalate into a nuclear war with each other. And I have some examples for you, sort of like the propaganda that you see during the time, and I'd like you to take a look at these photos and tell me what you see. And you can put responses into the chat box for these questions. Yes, no real direct fighting. Some hints that you might see is like, so you'll see in that first photo that there's John F. Kennedy and there is General Secretary Khrushchev, and they're both sitting on missiles and nuclear weapons. So they're both kind of at conflict with each other, where both of them don't want to use weapons or launch into a nuclear battle. You'll see by the other ones, it's also the same type of thing, like 2 warriors throwing both of them with bombs in the background, not wanting to really escalate into a real battle. Yes, older weapons. Exactly. Yeah, arrows, not wanting to use not wanting to escalate into using bombs that they had. But we'll move on, and now because now the Cold War launches into the Reagan administration. Now, President Reagan was elected in 1981, and he was the 8th president throughout the years of the Cold War to inherit the Cold War. He campaigned strongly as an anti-communism, but he did believe in peace. peace through strength, if you remember from your books, where anything that the United States could do to keep peace, but also keeping a strong arm to make sure that the United States stood strong in the face of communism. And we see this during his inaugural address.
To those neighbors and allies who share our freedom, we will strengthen our historic ties and assure them of our support and firm commitment. We will match loyalty with loyalty. We will strive for mutually beneficial relations. We will not use our friendship to impose on their sovereignty, for our own sovereignty is not for sale. As for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it now or.
So what's one thing that you noticed from President Reagan's speech? If you notice that, yes, confidence. Yes, he's very eloquent. He was known as the great communicator, so very well spoken, setting the tone. Yes, if you noticed, he was making a direct call within his speech, that he was making it clear that we're looking at the face of our enemies, which was at the time, remember, we're in the Cold War, the Soviet Union, but making it clear that peace is the answer, but the United States is not going to back down to the threats that communism is placing, as long as we can maintain a sense of stability, but making sure that we're looking to accomplish peace with this nation. Determined, yes. We will not surrender, absolutely. These are all great answers, guys. So President Reagan, throughout his 2 terms, his main accomplishment was that he wanted to find a way to peace, and more importantly, he saw that his ability to communicate with the Soviet Union was that they wanted to find a way for disarmament, to disarm, to not have to use nuclear weapons, to find a way to decrease them, which talks have already kind of had started to lay out through the SALT agreements. But what he was looking to is to find an ability to find some common ground and communicate to lead to a disarmament. And you can see this is the roadmap that we're going to go through. Each one of these specific incidents is a place where President Reagan had a chance to express his communication and lead to the talks that we'll see that will lead to the disarmament. So we'll start with the 1983 National Association of Evangelicals.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
So this is the significance of the speech. This was the first time that the President Reagan and a president in general had labeled the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Now, President Reagan saw that the Cold War was not a battle of 2 nations, but a battle of good versus evil. That the United States was not to blame for being launched into the Cold War, but that President Reagan saw this as an arms race to defend ourselves from the Soviet Union, which was launching an expansion campaign, taking over other nations and inflicting communism as their main source of political identity. And again, we go back to the peace through strength. President Reagan, shortly after this speech, urged NATO to create nuclear armed intermediate range missiles into Western Europe, because they were responding to the threat that the Soviet Union was installing as new nuclear armed missiles in Eastern Europe. So there was this constant chess match, and the United States was trying to remain its strength as an ability to make sure that the Soviets wouldn't launch or have the ability to launch a nuclear attack. So I want to ask you guys, in looking at the president's speech and then understanding this background, how do you think the president's speech made you feel as an American? Proud. Confident. Yes. Patriotic. Yes. Yeah, we are. Yeah, very, very much so. We are the good guys. So shortly after, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev takes office as the leader of the Soviet Union. Now, during the 2 years of President Reagan's administration, Mikhail Gorbachev was the third leader under President Reagan to take over as the head of the Soviet Union. And it's interesting, there are actually documents where President Reagan is speaking with Mikhail Gorbachev through letters, and President Reagan was trying to start up negotiations and have an understanding of peace between the two countries. But the Soviet leaders kept dying on him. So Mikhail Gorbachev taking office was like, he had to start anew and have like a new conversation to restart the peace talks. But what was important about Mikhail Gorbachev taking office was that he was very open-minded to restructuring the society of the Soviet Union and more so restructuring the economy. But to do that, peace had to take place first, and more so finding a way to disarm their nuclear arsenal by having an agreement with the United States. So the two sides decide that they need to have a summit. Now, a summit is where the two different countries get together and start having an understanding of where policy agreements can exist. And the first one happened in 1985 in Geneva, Switzerland.
Reagan is getting ready to head for the Geneva Summit Conference with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. In an address to the nation tonight, he said he was optimistic about the summit's outcome. The president says he's embarking on a mission of peace.
We go to Geneva with the sober realization that nuclear weapons pose the greatest threat in human history to the survival of the human race. But the arms race must be stopped. We go determined to search out and discover common ground where we can agree to begin the reduction, looking to the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth.
So this was the first meeting between President Reagan and Soviet General Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, leading into this meeting, there was distrust between the two leaders. Reagan saw that the Soviet Union was an empire, always constantly looking to expand their mission of communism. And during this time, there were threats of them moving into Afghanistan and Cambodia that made the president feel uneasy about how things were going to go with this type of administration. While on the flip side, General Secretary Gorbachev also had his own mistrust of President Reagan and the US. During this time, the technology for the Space Defense Initiative, which many of you may know as SDI, or Star Wars, as you might remember from your lectures, was taking place. And just to give you some background on SDI, it was the United States had the idea of technology where satellites and ground botanicals could be searching for missiles that would be coming as a threat to the United States and use lasers to disarm them. Gorbachev saw this as just a lead-in into space warfare and just something that was not something that he was in favor of. But when the two met, they found that there was a lot of commonality between them, and it wasn't exactly as a rough start as they would have thought. Actually, it's interesting. If you have any understanding of President Reagan, you know that he was a great actor in his day. And actually, President Gorbachev had seen many of President Reagan's movies. So he brought that up in the private conversations that they had. And on the flip side, President Reagan wrote actually in many of his memoirs that there was a warmth about President Gorbachev, that there was something that the two of them could work together in the long run. So in looking at this picture, what do you think this tells you about diplomacy? Hopeful, yes, absolutely. Personal relationships are important. I love that. That's such a great answer. Well, as I said, the two leaders found that there was some common ground, so they decided that it would be a good idea to have a second summit to where they could start hashing out the details of what denuclearization would look like. So they decided that they would have their next summit in Reykjavik, Iceland. And during the summit, the two started to hash out policies. Now, there was a lot of pressure on President Gorbachev. This was a difficult time in the Soviet Union as they were in dire need of reconstruction, as they were faltering from the economic strain, from putting all their resources a lot of their resources, I should say, into their military, into nuclear weapon expansion. It was having a drastic toll on their economic system and their industrial infrastructure. So he needed to find a way to peace, so that way he could start focusing on rebuilding the Soviet economy. And as the two were talking, there was a lot of good conversations that were happening. In fact, there was an agreement on the table for over a 10-year period that neither country would develop any type of new nuclear weapons, which was a huge, huge boon in the conversations to happen between the two. However, at the last moment, an issue popped up.
Tense situation. When asked, I expressed the categorical view that there was no way you could see the program through to a successful conclusion if we accepted the constraints that Gorbachev had in mind. Upon hearing that, he turned to Don Reagan and said, if we agree to this, won't we be doing that simply so we can leave here with an agreement? And it was a rhetorical question, of course, and you knew the moment he put it that he'd made his decision. And within seconds, it was over. Presidents grasp at treaties because they convey an image of presidents as statesmen and peacemakers, and they're sometimes not bothered about the details. It took tremendous discipline for Ronald Reagan to leave that little room without an agreement.
I still think we can find a deal, Reagan said. Gorbachev replied, I don't know what else I could have done.
He got into the car and his shoulders slumped. He was in the back seat. You would have thought that he had just lost a combination of the Rose Bowl and the Stanley Cup and the Olympics. He was so down. I've never seen a guy so beaten all my life. He said, Don, we were that close, and he held up his left hand, just finger and thumb that much. He said, we were that close to getting rid of all missiles. And he said he wouldn't give in. He kept insisting that we had to do away with SDI, and I couldn't do that. He said, I promised the American people I would not give in on that. I cannot do it.
So at the last minute, President Gorbachev says this deal looks great, but he asks President Reagan that the final agreement factor be that the United States stop research on the SDI program that I talked about earlier. And to President Reagan's credit, he had made a promise to the American people, as you saw from that video, that that was something that he could not budge on. He promised that SDI would be as a safety precaution for the United States, and it was a promise that he was going to hold to. And for that matter, that's why President Gorbachev decided to walk away from the deal that was on the table. So with that being said, that was a difficult decision for the president to have to make. Now, in your guys' lives, can you tell me about a difficult decision that you've had to make? I can say for me, one of the most difficult decisions that I had to make was 2 universities were giving me an acceptance to college, and it was a really hard choice for me to make, but one of them actually gave me more money and the other one wasn't providing as much. So it was a really hard decision for me to make during that time in my life. Choosing which high school to go to, yeah, I bet. Deciding to move, oh man, yeah, I know that factor. Yeah, that can be difficult for sure. To take a part-time job, oh yeah, absolutely. I like that answer. So we'll move on. And with peace talks stalled, President Reagan is asked and invited to give remarks at Brandenburg Gate. Now, there's huge significance to this because this speech is delivered about 100 yards away from the Berlin Wall. Now, the Berlin Wall is what divides East and West Germany, and what divides where democracy lives and where the beginning of the Soviet Union starts into communism. And so President Reagan at the speech decides to make a most prominent call for reunification of East and West Berlin. And this is where he challenges Gorbachev in his speech that this was a serious time and it was time to create some serious reform for the Soviet Union. And this was his call to say, peace needs to happen. Let's come back to the table. And you can see that by these famous words.
Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Huge words in our nation's history, especially from a president. So that same year, President Gorbachev decides to come back to the table, and the two are able to come to an agreement, which was known as the INF Treaty. And the treaty is a significant part because they decided that this was the first time in an agreement where both sides would limit the amount of nuclear weapons that would be established by both sides of nuclear power. And it required that the Soviet Union and the United States eliminate and permanently forswear their nuclear conventional ground-based ballistic missiles and their cruise missiles that ranged between 500 to 55,000 kilometers in feet. And it was the first time that they came to a reduction. Huge. This was a huge part in our nation's history. It would be into the next administration with President H.W. Bush, where you would see the Cold War coming to an end and the fall of the Berlin Wall. But this was a first big step to coming to peace. And to give you guys an idea, we have at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library an example of one of those missiles. This is the BMG-109 Griffin missile. And it was a ground-launched cruise missile that was developed by the United States Air Force. And this was one of the missiles that was deemed to be destroyed under the INF Treaty. So to give you guys a lasting glimpse, since the Cold War, nuclear weapons have expanded into other countries other than the United States and now Russia. However, Under President Trump's leadership, the U.S. pulled out of the INF Treaty in 2019 because Russia was in violation of the treaty under President Putin. So the INF Treaty actually is no longer in existence today. And that will be the last that I have for you guys today. I'm happy to take questions. I know it was a lot of information. I know for some of you guys, this is the final hours before you guys go that you may have if you are taking the AP US History exam, which is tomorrow. Good luck. If you have any questions, I'm sure this will be incorporated into the exam at some point. So if you would like to ask any questions about this lecture, we're happy to help. But that does it for me. I'm open for any questions that you might have. Yes, we will have a copy, or my email will be on the next slide actually. So if you'd like, you can send an email to me and I'm happy to provide a copy of the PowerPoint.
All right, if we don't have any other questions, I just want to thank everybody for attending today. We really appreciate you logging in. We do have some future sessions coming up at the end of throughout the end of this month, so please feel free to check those out. And thank you, Greg, for taking your time to share with us today.
You are welcome. Thanks, guys.
All right, have a great afternoon, everybody.